I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening, and thank you to everybody who has recommended the show to a friend. If you haven't done so, then just take a moment sometime this week and tell somebody who might like Slee Rickets what we're doing here. I am grateful. Thanks also to everyone who subscribes to the Secret Show. I put out another episode last week. I forgot to do a little free sample section preview for the free subscribers, but I will try not to fuck that up in the future. It's also come to my attention that some people have been cunningly finding ways around the paywall, which okay, man, like I can't be mad about that, but I would appreciate it if you are able to support the show, then please do so. There are a bunch of different tiers, and some people have opted for the rich tier, the rich person tier. There's a special tier just for you rich people. Some people have opted for that recently. I am especially touched. But whatever you are able to do, and if none of the cheap options are quite right, just write me a fucking note. Just write to sleeverickets@gmail.com and we will work something out. And if you signed up for the free subscription, I will just go ahead and throw a free week's trial at you. You don't have to do anything to do. You don't have to do anything. Just sign up. If you are subscribed to, let me know. I got some more stickers in. We have more of the black, the blue, pink. I think we may be out of rainbow. I'm not sure. And I got some white ones that actually look kind of cool as well. So free stickers if you subscribe, which is to say, if you already pay me money, then you don't pay me more money for the stickers. Just send me your address. And I got a special request from Zara for a non-hooded sweatshirt that says Slee Rickets but does not have a skull on it. Your wish is my command. There are two options now in the store that have Slee Rickets with no skull, and my brother's working on a bunch of new crazy designs that he's gonna. We'll do something with those. I don't know what that's all gonna amount to, but he's got some wild ideas. So we will see how that goes. I think that is all the housekeeping I have. Oh, I still need to figure out my fucking plane ticket, which is not good, but I am gonna try to be at the ALSCW conference next month. Almost in end of October. So if you don't know about the ALSCW, it is Alicia Stallings' line on it is like the MLA for people who like to read books. So I will try to. I think the conference is at Yale this year. I'm going to try to go. Maybe I will see some of y'all there. Yeah, I think that's all my housekeeping. Just very quickly because it's super late. This was a conversation. So it was initially supposed to be about relevance and Malcolm Mooney's Land, which is a very long poem. Well, not very long. It's not that long a poem by W.S. Graham. It feels a lot longer than it is. We did end up talking about that, but that's going to be on a separate episode along with some other. Cameron yelling at me about some difficulty related things. What we ended up talking about here more than I had planned was an article by Garth Greenwell about relevance in writing. And then we talked a fair amount about, identity and submissions and editors and cynicism, and as well as like kind of sincere invocations of identity in poetry. But that was all pretty interesting. So it is a little bit of a meandering conversation, but I've chopped up. We talked for fucking ever, so I chopped it up into two. And this week will be the identity and relevance stuff, and then either next week or on the Secret Show, I will put the rest of it.
Yeah.
This was recommended by Steve Tier, who sent this to me, and then I sent it to Cameron, and then we were negligent and only remembered this afternoon to send it to you, Alice. But I think it's a good article.
Yeah. No, it's great. I'm so glad that you sent it to me because I feel like it brings together so many threads of what we talked about and gives it a much more interesting angle, this angle of relevance, because I only just got to listen to a little bit of Difficulty Part 2 this morning. But you were talking at one point about, what do we go to poetry for? And then this article talks about this obsession, total obsession, which is everywhere. I mean, we were just talking about how it pops up in Star Trek, Doctor Who, Star Wars is probably doing it as well. Everywhere there is this obsession with, is this piece of art relevant?
Yeah.
If it's not relevant, it's almost as if it has to clear that hurdle before we consider whether it's good or not. And I love this piece because even though I don't fully agree with all of Garth Greenwell's points, he's highlighting that, he's bringing that into the light and saying, why are we so focused on this? Because we definitely are. I mean, he talks about that conversation that you have in the bookshop if you go with friends and you kind of pull out a book and you go, I couldn't be bothered to read another, as he puts it, novel by a straight white privileged guy about adultery.
Right.
And got to put that one aside.
He's really slicing it thin there. He's really he's lucky he's got the straight to throw in, because otherwise he's it's getting real close to home.
Yeah, it is. That is interesting. I thought that was very fascinating too, because he's writing from a very particular position. But yeah, this is just everywhere, and I think it is a really nice kind of continuation of this question of what do we go to art for? Recommend it.
Do you want to read like part of the initial stuff in it?
Yeah, there's a little paragraph from towards the beginning where he says, I see the prominence of relevance as a term of assessment in our current critical language as part of a huge and necessary correction, an assertion that these and other supposedly marginal experiences are pertinent, as all human experience is pertinent, to the communal endeavor to make sense of ourselves. That is the labor of art. So he's talking about, it is necessary to think about relevance to some degree. And then he goes on to say, anytime we praise the relevance of a particular novel, we are positing, at least implicitly, the irrelevance of other novels. And often enough, we make this judgment explicit. We are tired, I sometimes hear my friends say. I sometimes hear myself say, of stories about straight, white, privileged men contemplating adultery. We are tired of stories about Americans abroad. We are tired of stories about middle-class Malays. We are tired.
He also makes the point that something is lost, and it happened a while ago. I assumed it was more recent, but something is lost, or at least something changes in our use of the word relevant when we drop the preposition.
Yeah,
we no longer have to specify that it's relevant to something in particular. And like the unstated implication is that if something is relevant or irrelevant, it's relevant or irrelevant to life in this moment, and therefore implicitly, like, life in this moment is about this particular thing and not about all these other things. And I'm always shocked when I go through like literary chronological history, just look at when certain poems or books were written and see a date, and I think, like, holy shit, that was smack in the middle of World War II. That's nowhere in this book, or like you see that, like, oh yeah, every moment in time is about all of the things as well as the thing that we remember from history or that's on the news right now.
Yeah, I think about that a lot.
He does say early on that irrelevant has joined problematic as a term of absolute dismissal, which is totally true, I think. But then he says, true. Applied not so much to books one reads and hotly debates as to books one needn't read at all. And that seems to me almost backward. Is that, like, maybe there's a certain kind of bookshop conversation he's having with his friends, but, like, I don't know, Cameron, about you, but, like, I feel like what I do frequently hear is this or that is relevant. But we were talking earlier about, like, well, can we find a good example of somebody saying X is irrelevant? And, like, the closest thing we could think of was, like, sometimes what will happen is, like, some canonical writer will get dropped from a curriculum or will get dropped from, like, the GCSEs or whatever, and then people will jump in to defend him or say, oh, no, he's got to be in there. But seldom does somebody stand alone to say, like, let me talk about why this well-known writer is not relevant. Like, I would love to read an essay like that, but I was hard to think of an example.
Right. I mean, you hear a lot of people talk about stuff is problematic. But I don't know if I agree with Greenwell though. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say this book is irrelevant. I've heard people say this book is problematic and then just talk about it, but not that this book is irrelevant. And I wonder, like he talks about using the term irrelevant just as a note of dismissal, which I'd agree with. But then I've just never heard
But then that
anyone ever
argument, yeah.
call it irrelevant, even when they're dismissing a book. It's just, yeah, I just never encountered that applied in literary theory at all, I think.
Well, maybe people wouldn't use that exact word, but I think it is that conversation that he describes there about you're in the bookshop, you got to get something, you got to buy a book, but you have to sort through. You have to make some kind of decision about where you're going to spend this precious time that you have, and it just really simplifies things when you just go, okay, well, I'm not going to read anything by straight white guys.
Yeah, that does simplify things, but do you do that?
I have for a long time, but
Yeah.
recently have started to think about what my reasons are for doing that, and started reading some things that, like I read The Age of Innocence at the start of this year, and then I read Washington Square, and they were both just absolutely, they changed the way that I thought about a lot of things. And then more recently, went and looked at the work of the Australian poet John Forbes, and he was somebody who I had just dismissed completely because he is, bombastic, straight white guy. And I don't want to say that I regret dismissing him, but like I sure missed out on a lot by not
So
reading him.
you, if I'm understanding you, you've had a moratorium in place,
Yeah, I mean a fairly like unconscious
a porous
but
one,
yeah.
given that
Yeah,
you do
yeah.
interview it, as we've established, a shit ton of straight white guys. But like you,
Oh,
because
God.
like I had a friend here who, for like it had a standing moratorium on like I won't read any books by men for like years. She wasn't a literary podcaster. She wasn't a teacher. That wasn't part of her professional life or her vocational life. She just read mostly novels for pleasure, but she just would never read books by men. And like, I never tried to dissuade her. She's never going to run out of good books by women to read. But that is a real consideration you have applied in your own reading life.
Yeah, and Garth Greenwell gets to this towards the end of his piece, but it's about time, right? It's about the fact that like time is finite, and I felt as if I needed a way to get through the amount of stuff that I wanted to read, but thinking about but to sort it somehow and to kind of like make it feel a little bit more manageable. And at one point in the essay, he says, well, we could delete our Twitter accounts and unsubscribe from Netflix. And like, to me, that's kind of the heart of the whole thing. It's like, if you want to read as much as you want to have read, then something else has to go.
Yeah. I was going to say, Alice, was it not also a kind of political act? Because, I mean, so, our friend Dave Coates refuses to read white straight men. Refuses to review white straight men. He might read them and just not review them. I don't know. He refuses to review them, and like I don't know. I see no problem. I wouldn't judge anyone who does it, or judge anyone who. Well, no, I judge someone who'd cut a specific, like certain groups out of their reading, but not white straight men. But did you? So Alice, you're talking about it being a time constraint, but it's also a kind of socially conscious time constraint, right?
Yeah. Obviously, there's a political side to it, but I wouldn't want to make it sound like it was particularly well thought through or anything. It was more sort of an instinctive, like this conversation that he describes. I'm tired. I spend a lot of time listening to men, and maybe there's a way to correct that in my reading. And yeah, and the other thing is the gravity of this work. You end up back with them anyway, unless, I find this for myself anyway, unless you try to get out of that kind of tractor beam. And maybe it feels like that's not true anymore, and you're just constantly having work pushed on you that is not by straight white guys. But yeah, it's interesting how quickly you end up back in that world.
That's a really interesting thing, because I wonder how much the work that's pushed on you, the people pushing that work, I wonder how much of them are straight white men. Because like there's something I say slightly controversially to Matthew in a few emails, which goes something along the lines of the white poetry establishment, when it cares about relevance, tends to like writers who write about minority writers who write about subjects, and especially writers who write about that in very clear diction and clarity. So I mean, my controversial example is Danez Smith, who is very popular right about in America.
Yeah, I like Danez Smith. Yeah.
And I can trust him. This is not.
We have a spectrum. I appreciate. I think there's something he does pretty well that I appreciate it. I have a limited admiration for it. I think you probably enjoy it a little more, Alice. I think Cameron has far more scorn.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's fine. That's great.
My comparison of him would be with someone like Jay Wright, who I doubt either of you would like very much, but who I
like some things of his, but I just am not read.
Okay. He's very complex, and he doesn't write. He writes on some similar themes as Smith, but also a lot differently. And I get that there's an argument about difficulty here, and that he is much less well-read than Smith because he's more difficult. But he's much less well-read than, say, someone like Geoffrey Hill or J.H. Prynne or any of the language poets. He's not as famous as any of them. And I wonder if that's to do with his race, and also because the mainly white establishment, who like to make themselves feel better by attempting to push their sort of version of minority poets, would rather push people, Danez Smith and poets like that, who they feel quite comfortable with, than poets like Jay Wright, who challenge them and make them see poetry in ways that they wouldn't correspond with their typical ideas of relevance.
So do you think that it interacts with, like, do you think that is about the minority part, or do you think that's about the poetry that, like, do you think in an odd way, like, do you think Jay Wright would be more likely to get published if he were white, whereas Danez Smith would be less likely to get published if he were white, and writing the same poems? I mean, it's a kind of a semi-nonsensical thought experiment, but like, do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, it's hard because Jay Wright his poetry is so invested in sort of this myth making of a certain African mythology, so it's quite hard to imagine him as a white writer. But to an extent, yeah, definitely. I definitely think part of the neglect of Jay Wright is because of his race, because a lot of white people aren't prepared to find a black poet who is both complex and not talking about the themes that they want from their black poetry. I think a lot of sort of liberal white readers who make up what I think of as much of the poetry establishment do want that. That's why they would rather promote Danez Smith, because to an extent, reading him and liking him makes them feel happy and less like white racist. It makes them feel happier than Jay Wright does, who challenges them constantly.
And challenges them in what ways specifically? Because he can be a difficult poet just in the same way that Geoffrey Hill can sometimes be difficult.
Yeah, he's elusively intellectual, so it challenges them intellectually.
Yeah, his most recent book, I find just opaque. Like I could not make heads or tails. Clearly, explicitly because there were so many things that he had read and knew by heart, and I was totally unfamiliar with.
Yeah, I'd say he's maybe as much learned, if not more learned than Hill. I think he might be even more obscure than Hill at times. The reason I love him is mainly because of his two things. One, because I find him linguistically amazing. Like, I don't find any other writer writing lines or sentences or phrases like him. And secondly, because to me, I think he's idiosyncratic in as much as the only other poet I know who does similar things with him with mythology is Blake. Like, he has created a substantial body of, not to say prophetic, but certainly mythological narratives, which places him into this massive divine cosmological setting, which only Blake does similarly, and I find that to me is amazing, and not many poets do that. But yeah, I certainly think that Wright tests an audience intellectually and to an extent syntactically, and I think white people, some white, well, not all white, well, not all white people, obviously, but a lot of white liberal readers would subconsciously rather be tested by an intellectual poet, a white poet like Geoffrey Hill, and then go off and read some Dennis Smith and feel happy that they're quote unquote helping black poets, and also feel happy that they're understanding things that they think of as anti-racist, and spend time finding themselves intellectually challenged and even confused by a black person or a black poet. I think that's definitely part of the problem.
I think I may. It's funny because I think, and I don't know if this is telling in itself, but like I think my suspicion is that I'm more cynical than you, but I am less suspicious of, because I think what you're describing is like implies also like an internal, like a racial insecurity in a way. And I think I'm more cynical than that, you know. But I think in a way like I'm less racially cynical, and I'm more like morally and intellectually cynical. Like I think it has to do with getting credit. Like I like the last time I taught a college class, it was just a poetry writing class, intro level, and I got one extremely outspoken student who's a white woman, and she wrote a furious note in her student eval, which I'm sure didn't help me, that took me to task for only teaching one poem by a black poet all semester. And I was surprised because, you know, not by accident, like with some sense of conscientiousness, about 20% of the syllabus was black poets. But only one of those poems had talked about getting beaten up for being black. It was a Derek Walcott poem, and the rest of them didn't explicitly. Sorry, go ahead.
No, so you taught more than one black poet. It was just the only one black. Sorry, you taught more than one poems by black poets. It's only that one of those poems directly mentioned a very typical experience of blackness and racial violence.
Right, which may tell you that like maybe I'm not picking enough poems that deal with race, but like they were mostly poems about other stuff, about love or whatever. Or religion, but it made me think, like, because I think if you're editors, if you're publishers, if you're teachers, if you're anybody who's sort of making these decisions, I think it may be less that, because I tend to think that person who's genuinely interested in Geoffrey Hill will also probably be interested in Jay Wright. It's just that Jay Wright's not as well known. But I tend to I don't think that somebody who enjoys reading Geoffrey Hill will say, ooh, I don't like that this black poet is also very like smart and difficult and well read. I think it probably is more like, if I'm going to publish poems by black people, I want credit. I don't want there to be any mistake about it. And
I see that.
Does at least the logic of that make sense? I may be wrong.
No, I agree with it. No, I agree with that. Some people won't publish Jay Wright because they want credit, not because of the racial thing. I just also think that I'm right in the racial thing. Like, I just think both of those things are right. Sorry, Alice. No, all I was going to say is that's a kind of racism itself, right? Expecting
wanting credit. Oh, totally,
yeah.
Totally.
No, not wanting credit. Sorry. Well, that is racism as well. But expecting like everything's racism. But expecting a certain group of poets to talk about only a certain recognizable experience, like that white woman was like. That's really, I don't know.
It sucks. It sucks.
Yeah.
And like, I know I've like read on a couple of occasions various black and like non-white writers saying like that they're tired of this being a convention or being an expectation. I mean, yeah, obviously that would be incredibly tiresome.
Yeah.
Sorry, no. Go ahead, Alice.
Yeah, no, you're both pointing to like, a couple of really important things. Like one of them being that the people who are making the publishing decisions, the promotional decisions, marketing decisions, they are there at least. Privileged straight white guys talking about adultery. And the other thing is, and this is something that one of my interviewees brought up, is that pressure to sort of write a poem that sounds like an experience that we would expect from the person of that race. And the way that this interviewee put it was, occasionally she will write what she calls a brown poem, and she knows it will get published. And what I said to her was, that's
I
such an
remember that.
indictment on the
Yeah.
editors, you know.
Yeah, I remember that.
I was so glad that she said that. There was something else I was going to say.
So
and now it's
do you think that this essay then, because he doesn't belabor the point, but when he talks about relevant or this is relevant or, you know, I'm tired of reading this kind of story, or I don't need another story by this kind of person. Is this largely identity then? Is it, and is that just about like, this is something that people in public are talking a lot about in educated circles, and therefore like, in order for something to be relevant, it has to account for that in some way, either by virtue of its subject matter or by virtue of who's writing it? Like, is that that's what relevance is really pointing to here?
Yeah, sort of. It's like you guys were saying. It's a form of kind of getting credit / ass covering. It also completely elides actually important work that you could be doing in your real life, you know, away from your fucking who you're going to publish. And I mean, obviously that's important to it,
Right.
to a huge extent as well. But like, to point to your bookshelf that is full of writers of color and sip on your Chardonnay is just a kind of a shitty look.
Which doesn't make many people's lives better. The thing that I resisted a little bit in this essay, it was more of an unstated implication, I guess, throughout, that he talks about relevance, and he talks about the danger of you know, restricting.
Yeah, there's a passage where he says, it seems to me that either we believe that all human experience is valuable, that any life has the potential to reveal something true for every life, a universality achieved not through the effacement of difference, but through devotion to it, or we don't. I want to encourage a proliferation of voices and stories, not their repression.
Yes. So and that's the larger theme, and then the more nitpicky thing as well, which is, and you could tell that's at least I gather that was a sentence that he had to get out as his like eyeglasses screwdriver for. Like, I want to, what does he say? I want to encourage the proliferation.
The proliferation of voices and stories, not their repression.
Not their repression. Which then, like, that was when I stepped back from this whole article and I said, well, who's going to bell the cat? Like, what are we actually talking about here? Are we just talking about when you go into a bookstore? Do you buy this or do you not? Like, what is the top-down proliferation or repression that is being done or not done here? It is like, and I think it may be because he's an academic, he's thinking in terms of like a syllabus.
Yeah, or I think he's also talking in terms of shelf space. Like he goes on to say, I think in the next paragraph, I can't bear the thought that art is a zero-sum game, that we have to choose which kinds of stories are relevant and which lives have value. I can't bear the thought that works of art exist only at the expense of other works of art, that books are locked in some kind of ferocious competition for space. And I understand that is an unbearable thought, but that's a reality, Garth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you say shelf space,
that's like capitalist truism.
Oh yeah. Do you think, when you say shelf space, are you thinking, Alice, about shelf space in your house or shelf space in a bookstore?
Both, but I'm primarily thinking about a bookshop. Like when you go in, it's that thing of like, which book gets to sit with its cover out?
Right.
Like, that's always an interesting thing.
I mean, I know that they're in like the little indie bookstore in our neighborhood, which is great. They have, one of their conventions is that the people who work there get to choose a lot of the books that face out, but it's by specifically selecting them and pinning a note to them saying, I liked this book and here's why.
Yeah.
And clearly that note can carry any level of, of sincerity or not, or disingenuousness. But the question of relevance in a bookstore seems like that, again, that seems like a misplaced concern. Like, that's like, the bookstore has to think about what the fuck it's going to sell, doesn't it? Like, doesn't that have to be the primary concern?
Yes, but if your market is
neurotic,
middle to upclass white people who want to come and buy a book that makes them look good,
right? Yeah, what they want is relevance. That's the selling point. Yeah. that should be a whole table. Then they should just have like relevant. I mean, I guess they honestly they
It
do.
is.
They
There's a whole bookshop
yeah.
fucking up the road that is
Right.
just all
Yeah,
those books, and I go into it and I'm like, give me a book that doesn't stress me the fuck out.
Are you can I repeat the thing you said in text about Kevin Young?
Oh,
Or should we leave that out?
yeah. As long as it's like on the record that like I really think he seems like a lovely guy. But yeah,
No,
go
yeah,
ahead.
and like a terrific poet, and like I mean, I have admired him for a long time, and I think he can get sloppy as a poet, but I've enjoyed lots of his poems, and I think they're both like at its best they can be both like clever and very cunningly constructed while also being immediately pleasing and moving. But you made a remark about his current version of the New Yorker poetry podcast.
Yeah, I was listening to him talk to Eileen Miles, and I listened to him talk to I think Christian Wyman as well. So they're the only two that I've listened to recently, but it just felt so dishonest. The whole conversation just felt so totally dishonest on both sides. Like both people were just trying to signal how good they were, what good human beings they were, and talking totally past each other about the poems. Yeah, I mean, like I've said this before, Matthew, but your podcast has completely ruined me. I can't listen to this.
Yeah, no, that's the exact reason why I like this podcast, because every other podcast I found was just utterly boringly positive. And like, I used to a poetry magazine podcast, and I think I've for 2 years, and I found 5 poems, I think, for those 2 years that I actually liked, and it was just so boring.
Yeah, and just coming back to the difficulty thing as well, like no one is ever willing to say, I don't quite understand this line. That's why I used to love Curtis Fox. Oh, Curtis, because he would actually say, I don't really know what this is about. Let's think about it.
How do I not know that name?
He used to do...
You used to do Off the Shelf.
Poetry Off the Shelf, yeah.
Yeah, you did that.
Oh, is that a podcast? Where is that?
Yeah, it was a Poetry Foundation podcast.
Poetry Foundation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. I have
Talk
after
about
listening to
gatekeepers.
it. The problem is for them that was my bias or my prejudice was just that I listened to a handful of Poetry Foundation podcasts at random and then I swore them all off.
That's
so
fair.
he was the good one.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
I liked it. And yeah, the zero-sum game, the competition for space.
Well, when he said art, I started thinking about this more generally. And I thought there is, in some art, where I can totally understand and even agree with the idea that we need to make it relevant. And I think it's when the relevance doesn't intrude into the actual stylistics of the art. So I'm thinking a lot of sort of TV series which suddenly take on a broader diaspora of actors of different minorities, if you want to use
Yeah,
that
all of
term.
a sudden Girls has non-white actors in it.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
And that seems to me like a very, I really could not care at all about that. I'm not upset about that being relevant at all. Like, that's a very good relevance. So I really, really worked out that what I disliked was people calling poems relevant because I think they thought they would make the poems sell more and more people would read them. So I sent Matthew, and I think I sent you, Alice, but I don't know if you had time to read them. It's totally fair if you didn't. 2 articles.
No,
from
I
the,
did. I read them. Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty. There's one about Dante, which is just like, it's not about Dante at all. It's just about the Guardian's hatred of Boris Johnson, which is like fair, but like I want to hear Dante's an amazing poet, but like you wouldn't know this from here. You just they just like fantasize about putting Johnson in an imaginary torture chamber that bears some resemblance to Dante's Inferno. And
Those 2 pieces were completely infuriating. Like, it's just like...
The one about Lowell wasn't too bad, but, it wasn't great.
But still, it's like, as people who care about and read and sometimes write poetry, when you read something like that, you're just like, you don't need to convince me of this thing's relevance. I'm engaged with it anyway. And also, it shouldn't have to be relevant for everybody to care about it. It should be good. And then people should care about it.
Because plenty of stuff is relevant. Like, they're like, want...
Like, to an extent, what isn't relevant? Because every emotion we feel now, we felt 3,000 years ago. So any work of
Totally.
art, whether bad or good, is relevant.
Well, in the version of this conversation that I have heard that maybe makes some of this at least make a little bit more sense, in the same way that like it or lump it, the bookshop has to sell books. I think like the newspaper has to get clicks or sell copies, and the version of this conversation where I've heard more of a challenge in the form of like this is not relevant is specifically with theaters saying, why should we do this show now?
Yeah, that's a huge thing. God.
And it is either when like a show's in development and it's like, can we tweak something to make it more of the moment, or like, how are we going to pitch this, or like, are we going to put Julius Caesar in a gangster costume to make, like whatever, like, especially with, oh God, Shakespeare is the worst because people just love to like slap a new skin on Shakespeare in order to make it seem politically relevant. I mean, politically relevant, and it's always that particular move, and it's always just insufferable.
Wasn't there that famous Trump thing about, was it Julius Caesar? Didn't someone do like a Trump?
Oh yeah, someone did it like a Trump mask Julius Caesar. But like they had Julius Caesar wear a Trump costume, and they had which can like even if you were gonna do like it doesn't transpose all that well. Like it's not even a good choice. It's just it's just that you knew you were gonna get a write up about it.
That's all. Straight to sort of conceptual art, sort of the junk food of art, as I think about it, and it's sort of a nice concept, and then it doesn't survive like after one encounter, and then like the second encounter, it just grows more and more stale as a concept.
Yeah, and that is the cleanest and cruelest definition of conceptual art that I've encountered, is that it is art where hearing it described is identical to the experience of seeing it, or reading it or whatever. Like knowing the concept is the whole thing, and then you don't as with Kenny Goldsmith, you don't actually have to read it. But is there like trying to play devil's advocate with the newspaper? They've got Robert Lowell at 100, and then what was the occasion of the Dante one? Was it the 700th? So it was literally, there were anniversaries in both cases. Mm. Is it just we need something to fill this space, and here's some. I mean, like that's the relevance to start with. Is like, well, what big anniversaries are coming up? Like who? Like I was trying to imagine the conception of each of these pieces.
Yeah, what's the pitch meeting like with this?
Because it was like, because in both cases, like the relevance question is so central that what was not the case is that somebody wrote, like somebody who loved Dante wrote an essay about Dante, and then they said, how can we make it seem more? Like relevance was at the heart of each of these as the occasion for it. So who came up with the idea? And is this just a question of like editing drudgery for like the publishing world?
Yeah, because it's like you can't go to the newspaper and just say, I wrote this piece about how wonderful Dante is. Would you please publish it?
Yeah. But with the Guardian, I sort of see it as a very good-hearted, mediocre feeling on their part. Like I think their heart's in a good place. It's just that it's just really idiotic.
It's a good but stupid place.
Yeah, like it is. That really outlines the Guardian's way of treating poetry and literature more generally, I think.
Did we sufficiently address the Greenwell?
At the beginning of the Greenwell, he says the etymology of relevant is something like to relieve. And at the end of the Greenwell article, he talks about a painting he has in his room, which he doesn't think is particular. Does he describe it? I don't think he describes it in detail. He just doesn't say it's very relevant.
It sounds like he gives a description, but it just sounds very like abstract.
Yeah. And then he closes with like saying how the picture raises up his apprehension, his perception in a way, because it makes him rise to its level, which I really like. I think that's what, in some way, that's what I'm looking.
Insightful writer, and I think this whole piece is really lovely. And I was also very touched that he started with etymology, because like it's such a nerdy thing, and it's such a thing that's so dear to my heart. So I loved that whole beginning. Same. We didn't actually talk about here. I'll just read the first paragraph because I think it is quite nice. He says the word relevant I was recently surprised to discover, shares an etymology with the word relieve. This seems obvious enough once you know it. Only a few letters separate the words, but their usages diverged so long ago that I had never associated them before. Searching out etymologies is an old habit, picked up in the decades when I aspired to be a poet. Language is fossil poetry, Emerson says. And the poem the Oxford English Dictionary lays out, in this case, is remarkably moving. The common forebear of both relevant and relieve is the French relever, which meant originally to put back into an upright position, to raise again, a word that twisted through time, scattering meanings that our two modern worlds have apportioned between them, to ease pain or discomfort, to make stand out, to render prominent or distinct, to rise up or rebel, to rebuild, to reinvigorate, to make higher, to set free. I think that's wonderful, and it's just totally the way I read dictionaries. And I really appreciated that entry into the essay. I appreciate the whole essay. I think it's a really smart and well done essay. The ending with like stars, they're just like us. They're like, all you need to do is travel abroad and see a beautiful painting and buy it and put it above your desk too. Annoying to me. And then the other thing is just the like, you know, again, it's always the leap from the descriptive to the prescriptive, which is like everything he's saying about relevance, everything he's saying about like observe. I love like starting with his own personal experience and examining it, because I like that habit of thought is one I have adopted and find really useful myself. But then the leap to, I wish to encourage the proliferation and not the like, to me, it's the same, like, there ought to be a law impulse. It's like, well, somebody ought to do something. And that feels to me like a kind of an impotent gesture.
Yeah. It's the archaic torso of Apollo move.
The archaic torso of Apollo myth?
Elaborate on that. You must change your life. Like, it's just annoying. Stop telling me. But
it's different. It's like one must change our lives. Like
Yeah.
our lives ought to be changed. Is how this essay would put it, I think.
Yeah, it's just homework. It's yet more homework.
But it's also like it's nebulous homework.
Yeah,
right?
no, I don't. I know that I'm wrong. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to fix it, but I know that I'm wrong. Maybe I should go buy some more books.
Yeah,
Sure,
but I know.
I'm
totally am grateful for the essay, and he's just a very skilled and lucid reader, writer. I gather that he's also a good reader, but yeah, he's a very like smart and also very effortless to read writer. So it's totally worth reading. I just I have my nits I like to pick.
Yeah, I really like the essay. And I really like the name of that move, Alice. But stop shitting on my boy Rilke, please. He's so good.
No, I won't. I really don't.
But you have beyond this, you have like a specific argument, like you have a gripe with that poem for that reason.
Yeah, I've always found it exceptionally irritating.
Give us your, because I think I adore that poem, and I think Cameron does as well. But I also I want to hear. Yeah.
Oh God, I'm not prepared for this.
But Cameron, you were gonna. We were interrupted by my daughters, but you said that you kind of made a compromise with yourself when it comes to writing from identity by way of this persona.
Oh Christ, yeah, no. I'm like, I really worked hard not to mention my poetry on the podcast because neither of you do it that much, and like it does. I don't think it's very good, and it doesn't. It's not helpful because that's not what people at the podcast come for. But like, now that you're forcing me, Matthew, yeah. So like, I'm writing a sequence, or I'm midway through a sequence, or I'm at the beginning of a sequence, I don't know yet, about a poet who is very unoriginally named the Blind Poet. And like, the character isn't me. It's not Geoffrey Hill, but it takes a lot of inspiration from Geoffrey Hill's idea of a sort of traumatized old man.
Yeah.
And I do want to write about blindness, and I'm attracted to writing about that. But I'm also attracted to write about other things, and then there's also the idea of, will these poems about blindness end up being published more than poems about other things, because the able-bodied white establishment want to make themselves feel better by publishing quote unquote diverse voices. So what I've tried to do is make a very sort of cantankerous, argumentative, and ultimately very, very complex attempt to talk about blindness. So these poems are often, I think they're often about language and about I described one to Shane as like attempting to make sort of a blind language, so sort of darkness visible. So as much as they're describing blindness, I think they're also reaching towards a kind of blind language, or at least a language that is less interested in light and dark than it is interested in texture and a sort of synesthetic understanding of the world. It's very hard to describe in prose, which I will admit I kind of like. I kind of like that these poems are sort of heading towards are heading towards unparaphrasability. Although, as Alice really well points out, I need to be careful that I'm not writing things that are just compressed for the sake of compression and can't say something plainly without being not compressed. So
otherwise, I'll be so mad at you. Like, furious.
That you're like,
she won't even give you false assurances about that one.
Like I envision what you're going to say, and I scream in terror, and like that's how I keep myself going. But yeah, so I'm trying to write this sequence, and I think that's one of the reasons why I sent you Malcolm Mooney's Land, because I was very interested at that time, and because I was trying to write a poem, which I then selfishly sent to both of you about the inability to communicate with language, and and Graham also talks about the inability to communicate with language, and that is why this poem so hooked me, and still hooks me. I still love it. But yeah, have I made a good enough segue there?
I think no. I think so.
Do you want to ask me? Are there any questions you want to ask me about this before we hit Graham, or like?
I mean, so you brought it up as like the question, like the way you came to that topic was by saying that you've thought at times about writing poems that you thought would be more readily and easily pitchable to editors, that would get published more effortlessly because of sort of trading on your identity. And then it seems like that kind of like understandable universal thought then brought you somewhere else. Like you started with that kind of cynical thought, and then it led you to a different place. Like, well, what if I did write about blindness, but not in a way that was just like an autobiography?
Right. Yeah, I started there and sort of wondered why you do if I took sort of the confessional and then put it into a voice that was similar to my own, but also was pitched at a different level to my own. And that's where I ended up, I think. And then,
which is kind of a protective move. Like you're actually trying to protect your project from that extremely self-serving impulse on the part of the editors to display their own enthusiasm for diversity, quote unquote.
Right. And it's interesting because...
All right, sorry, go ahead. I'm fixing a
Sure. Yeah. No, of course, yeah. No, it's just interesting because an editor won't be able to tell whether the writer of these poems is blind or not, and I wonder sometimes if they'll ever ask me, if I am or not, and they'll ask me, like, and maybe they'll assume I'm not, because obviously there's not a lot of blind writers out there, and they'll tell me that this is sort of, not cliched, but a sort of a taking on of someone else's identity. So that really fascinates me, whether I should explain to them that these are drawn from my own personal experiences, even if they're not my voice, or whether they'll come at me that way. No, that just... So yeah, I guess it's like literary politics and personal aesthetics clashed when it came to write this sequence.
Do you think they should ask you?
No, I don't think they should ask me.
I suspect that you may be right in something else you said, which is that this is a subject that writers still mostly think of in metaphorical terms. I don't think this has caught people's attention in quite the same way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you may slip it past the goalie, actually.
Mm. And like I could just phrase them as like a series of translation from Rilke or Baudelaire, because like, like
no one's going to check.
They're not experienced with Rilke, yeah, but like Baudelaire and Rilke both wrote poems about the blind, which are not incredibly positive. Like, I don't think most people will probably try and cancel those poems because they're not very like kind to the blind. And like, I don't know. I to be honest, I prefer them to fucking David Yezi's poem, which like okay, we're gonna badmouth Yezi now. Like, I'm so, like, he's appeared on this podcast, so like, sorry, but like,
no, I think he's like a wonderful critic, and he's written some wonderful poems, and he's written poems that are not as good. But that, you know, there's one in particular that isn't
very good.
Yeah, it's called Dizzy. I'll include a link to it. But yeah, I mean, but it's like I think certainly my own experience has been that, like, I've written blind. I had a novel that like it's in my shelf and will never go anywhere. But there was a blind character in that, and I definitely was not thinking of, like, I definitely started with that as a metaphorical question, because it was, I mean, in my case it was more drawing from like Greek myth, but like it definitely, I reached for it the way I would reach for a metaphor. It's like the character who, for the first half of the book, he can see and then he loses his sight. It's like there are lots of different things going on with him, but for me, I definitely like thought of it first as a metaphorical value rather than just as a thing that some people live with. So I think that's pretty common still, like in the way that obviously like less so among people who actually experience it, but like, you know, you read certain kinds of old stories, and totally characters of different races or sexes, like totally, like, we've used all of these different identity, you know, tags as metaphor or as like a signal for any number of other things. And I think this is just one where we haven't shifted our focus on it yet, to use another visual figure of speech.
Although I think it's coming.
I think so.
Raymond Antrobus has just published a disabled manifesto, I think, in Poetry Magazine.
And
I read it, and
deaf, or his family is deaf, or
I think he's deaf and his parents weren't deaf. I'm pretty sure. Like, I read it and thought, fair enough. I had like no like, I didn't think, oh, this is such a good manifesto, I'm now going to take on. I just thought, this is kind of nice. Although, to be fair, it wasn't much of a manifesto. Like, a lot of it was autobiographical reminiscences about white people saying weirdly controversial things about black poetry. Like a large PowerPoint was that, which I found, to be honest, more interesting than the Disabled Manifesto. But yeah, like, I think it's coming, but it's not quite here yet.
Is there a version of a disabled poet? Is it specifically like poetry or just literature or something else? Like, is there like a disabled literature or poetry manifesto thesis that you could imagine or would want to have articulated?
No, I don't think so. Because I feel like any manifesto that tries to hold up as positive will in some way be contradicted by the sequence I'm writing now, which at times can be very self-pitying and not very positive.
Sure.
But like, I don't know. I don't want to write manifesto. And to be honest, like, the poems, like, the sequence was not particularly inspired by poems by other disabled writers. Like the biggest influence probably was Shane's Jim Limber sequences, or Angel and or the Hastily Assembled Angel, because I really liked what they were doing of playing off variations while not forming a narrative, and I thought I could do that. But yeah, no, I don't particularly subscribe to disabled manifestos. I think their heart's in the right place, but I think they're ultimately going to exclude some type of literature, and often when they're positive, they're going to deny the most interesting part of the poem, which is the unsettlement of language. I think, at least for some of them.
So would you ever write any kind of poetry? Like, would you write your Poetry Should Be Weird manifesto?
Yeah,
is that something
I'd write
that
that.
Interests you? You would, yeah.
Yeah, I'd write. I don't know if it'd be a manifesto.
Sure.
I'd probably write an essay. I'd probably write an essay starting with something like G.K. Chesterton's line about the imagination should be used to make real objects atypical, or what's the word for abnormal? Not unusual. You can't find it.
Got it. The function of imagination is not to make strange things settled so much as to make settled things strange, not so much to make wonders facts as to make facts wonders.
Yeah, and I'd probably start, if I was going to write an essay, I'd probably start there, and sort of try and lurch down a particular literary alley towards the idea that poetry should unsettle language. So that would be my manifesto. But I don't think I'd really want to write about disability, because apart from these blind poems, like a lot of my narrators can see.
Yeah.
So for me, like it seems to me that autobiography and fiction is inextricably linked in sort of my writing of poems. So I really couldn't settle on one, at least to me.
This is something I thought about, because I had a fondness, especially in grad school, for a poet named Paul Guest. I don't know if you know him. He's an American poet. He's from Georgia, where I'm from originally. But his first collection was called "The Resurrection of the Body and the Ruin of the World," and it has some. I mean, he grew up in the Deep South, and so there's you can't escape Christianity, but mostly, I mean, he's an extremely like vibrant, imaginative, funny poet who writes about. I mean, it is now. I feel like I've now seen a gajillion poems that are like written in the voice of some like Looney Tunes character, but he did that at least before I'd ever seen anybody else do it. And he he mixes the high and the low and the funny and the serious, and writes about etymology, writes about classical literature, and I found him just to be like a poet who like opened up a lot of things for me in an interesting way, but also he writes very movingly about when he was a child, he was in a bicycle accident and broke his neck, and he's paralyzed from the neck down, and he writes about that specifically. And then he also writes poems that are just about, and they're not, I would say they're about language, but probably not in as like a way you would like as much, because they are a little bit more at face value. But then there are other poems he writes that are in a voice that is like, when he's writing about things that sort of don't require the speaker to have any kind of body, then then it doesn't come up at all. But then I find that when I'm reading poems of his that in which the speaker seems to have a body that is not paralyzed from the neck down, I have like a slight dissonance in reading it. If only just because I've read his poems that are so moving about his own biographical experience, and then I find I'm broken out of the fantasy of imagining this as sort of just being in his voice, which of course is always a little bit of a fantasy. But yeah, like it's something I've thought about in reading his poems and admiring them, across a number of books, not just that one, but that there can be a trap there. Like you could see how he could be pushed to write again and again and again about this one particular aspect of his life, and that pressure could come both from publishers and from readers.
Right. So, can we just slightly push into dissonance? So, do you mean you find a dissonance there yourself? So you just find a dissonance there because the writer who wrote about bodies can't fully operate his own body, or is there a dissonance there that he doesn't write about bodies well?
No, I don't find that he doesn't write about bodies well. It's not even like he will like describe a body. It's more like he will just refer to actions. And
okay.
And I think in particular, I think with his poems, it sticks out more because his poems tend to be so personal and lyric and moving, so that it's like it is like when he writes in the voice of Foghorn Leghorn, I don't think I would need to see a paralyzed Foghorn Leghorn. Like I don't obviously many of his poems that are very good poems, I think, are written in a voice that feels extremely close to home, and they're writing about like a domestic love, like they're writing about things in which, like situations in which I can very easily insert him. And I think part of the difference is that like if you read who's the guy who just wrote like a gajillion beautiful sonnets and nothing else? I can't remember his name.
Terence Hayes.
No, not Terence Hayes. No, this is like from like mid 20th century. I'll remember his name later. But or like Edna St. Vincent Millay writes a lot of love poems. She had a lot of lovers. A lot of those are true to life, but also like many of them are written in a way that like it kind of doesn't matter who it is. And I think maybe the thing that with Paul Guest creates that catch for me, because it's not at all that I think like the poems are flawed. I think there is like maybe a meaningful question here.
It's a bull guess, Bowen.
Yeah, I'm going to find one that is like very specific to. Okay, here. Yeah, it's been a while since I read this, and I don't know totally what I think, but this is the title poem of the book. It's a little long, but I'll try to go through it relatively quickly because I think it's fairly lucid. And I think it's just like it's very specific to him. Like this could only be Paul Guest, or not so much. I don't mean so much like the style. I mean like the speaker of this poem could only be Paul Guest. It's called The Resurrection of the Body and the Ruin of the World. Kissed for the first time, Heather Wilson cornered me behind a tree at recess until I stung. She pressed me into the bark. Until my shirt was sap-specked hung, I wrenched away the clumsy pop between us, my nervous word echoing as I ran, dizzy, scared, cotton-mouthed. On show and tell day our courtship ended. Heather was to perform for the class a baton-twirling routine. Desks were moved, a turntable set up. She changed into spangles for that lumen hour. Her emergent shimmer she dedicated to Kent Goodwin, skewering me clean through as the record needle dropped onto the hazy groove of Eddie Rabbitt's I Love a Rainy Night, a 45 I sometimes find in jukeboxes or on dying AM radio stations. No one knows how to hear anymore. Tonight's damp quiet falls from the roof like bits of soap or snow. A night Chicago radio is clear. Sometimes Toronto if it is cold, the sky scrubbed raw. I say names out loud because the air's a poor listener, the best forgiver. Questionable behavior, I know, that leads me to the questionable science of those who believe that the voice's energy is undiminished by time, that its thin diatoms furl forever through air as if the sky were a giant chalk conch spiraled from the dirt, up and away from us, returning not a siren's empty, set, white noise, not the ocean's licking whisper, but the muddle of all lapsed talk. That, for example, we might reclaim Lincoln reading the Emancipation Proclamation from the ionosphere, that we might flicker once more the first words of love, which were lit candles falling from our mouths through napalm, that the shortest distance is not 1 but 0. Here come the lost spears I threw from a flashlight into the night sky, and here they go. So simple and straight, there could never be anything curved or crooked, not smiles, not teeth, lips, voices, or lives, and yet I snapped my spine into like a charred wick when I was 12. Kent Goodwin died a year before from an undiagnosed brain tumor. The dead in Christ shall rise again, shall bring to my Father's mouth the hush that comes at odd times when he quotes the book of Job to me. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. It's then that tears might be unworkable, the body only a house fire, a hard, bloody cough into the fist, and each eye a pin-cushion of embers. There they go. Dusk fireflies, sparklers, a silver baton, world without end. Inside, the radio is haze through the dark as I hold my breath, as my lover asks before taking me into her mouth. I watch her hair fall forward along the lines of her face, drape my hips. It blurs into the question she'll ask later, if it's must. No, I'll say, but now I imagine nerve endings that wire through each strand on her head as I touch the heel of my palm to her and shudder. She seems to drift through me slowly and yet stays. Into the dark I go more than I come, and on my way I give my mind to voices that speak beyond ideas of gravity, that do not rise or fall, or bloom as we imagine the humid lives of lilacs. I'm hardly there, but here, small and distant as a star whose light quickened long before tonight. The voice of a lost friend places its mouth on mine, and all I can think of is stopping his words that lurch even after weeks. That Heather's now a lesbian grocery cashier in a town miles removed. I insist I don't care, but he winks, saying, "Come on, you know you drove her to it. You'd pay to watch." So obviously there's an enormous amount in that poem, and it's like, you know, when I say that only Paul Guest could have written it, I certainly don't mean like he's the only person who could touch all of these different topics. But like, you know, situated in the center of that poem is this accident and then the condition that follows from it. And I love this book. His next book is called Notes from My Body Double, which you know, it's hard to read without some kind of, you know, additional meaning there. But then. And then also in these books are, you know, poems, as I said, like about old cartoons or old weird sci-fi movies or things that have, you know, are sort of totally removed from anybody's kind of immediate domestic experience. But then also in these books are some poems in which the speaker refers to, you know, speaks in this same intimate, domestic, situated way, and then refers to performing actions that are that seem to exclude the possibility that this is him writing with his own life in mind. And I think it's that sort of funny collision of like lyric possibility that will sometimes kind of jar me as I'm reading it, if that makes sense. Like if he had not written
Right.
at all lyrically in that kind of personal, intimate way, then it would be like writing anybody's imaginative poetry. But when some of your poems take their power from that kind of intimate personal experience and others don't. I mean, I think like a similar example would be like Reginald Dwayne Betts, who like his life is, not insignificantly defined by a long stretch that he spent in prison as a very young man because of a crime he committed. Like it's a huge, traumatic, defining, both like terrible and also in some ways maybe salvific experience that marks his life and marks many of his poems. But it would be, I think it might startle one if he were to write a poem that was not a dramatic monologue, but was just sort of an ordinary poem written from the perspective of somebody who could be him except for this thing. Right. And I don't mean to say that anybody should or shouldn't write anything as a result of this. I'm just trying to identify what it is that I've experienced sometimes in reading these kind of poems. Does any of that make sense?
Yeah,
that definitely
completely.
makes sense. No, I was just going to say it's an extra conceptual jarring, I guess. Like the jarring is outside of the poem.
You're
I
sorry,
do-
you're
like
a little
I-
quiet again if you don't mind. I keep yeah.
Sorry, and like no, that's my fault. Yeah, so like an extra conceptual jarring outside of the poem itself, and like I guess that the poem, well, I guess that one can talk about experiences that one has not physically experienced and still find mental autobiographical elements within them. Like
Yeah.
the poems where Paul Guest is talking about someone with a body might not be totally fictional experiences. They're probably a blend of both fiction and autobiography.
Totally.
Probably.
Yeah. I think
Sorry,
you're right.
go on, Alice.
Yeah, well, it just strikes me listening to you both talk about this is that really what we're getting at is the fact that we can never properly forget who the poet is, even though there's this strange idea that we should, and we should come to every poem completely like divorced from the idea of no biographical readings ever, which I don't know why.
Where
we
do
have
you
that.
encounter that idea today? I'm curious.
Yeah, no, good point. Probably, certainly, there's very little of it left. Hey, that's a good point.
But I mean,
still
I
in-
feel a little bit of that impulse. Like I feel
I-
like
I
I
do.
should be able
Yeah.
to read.
Yeah,
that
no,
way.
I do. Same.
Completely. Yeah, I should be able to appreciate this like completely divorced from who this poet is. I should be taking this work on its own merits, whatever the hell that means.
Yeah.
So, but of course you can't. Even with, I mean, yeah, just like people who've had like relatively, for lack of a better word, straightforward lives.
Yeah.
Still thinking about what led them to this poem.
Yeah.
I
Well, I
am
mean,
anyway.
and as like where people certainly took note of that when Anders Carson we wrote a poem about being a panhandler, that this is something outside of his experience. And I get like I'm always less interested in the question of like whether this is allowed, because that's always sort of a funny kind of mental exercise. Then like how does this affect like the reader's experience, and is it, and I mean, and I guess to whatever extent, like I do want to be able to read poems on their own merits. Like I think you're right that there's some to some extent that's probably always impossible. Even if only because you can only read them in languages you speak. But I do aim for that. I do hope for that.
Yeah, you keep reaching for it. Yeah.
Shane has a really good comment on I have a podcast called, I think it's Commonplace, Common Mind, something like that. And he says something along the lines of, poets or writers should be allowed to write. Men should be allowed to write in the perspective of women, and explicating that, white people should be allowed to write in perspective of black people. But just right now, our political situation at the moment really maybe for good, precludes that a little because of how we are contextually positioned in history. And I find that like really fascinating and probably a truism, but like that seemed really interesting to me.
Yeah.
But like
that is a really good interview.
Sorry, go on.
And like, it is a moment, right? Like, that's the important thing to keep in mind here too. This is not the word that Greenwell uses is corrective. I think that's fair to apply. Yeah. And so, which to me just means there's no need to kind of panic or worry about it. Like, it's something that's moving through.
Yeah, I'm always more cynical than you.
That's okay.
Because I think of it even like a degree removed from that. Like, cause I'll, friends will sometimes or family members will take up various questions that are in the news or in public conversations, and like my response is often like, well, I basically agree with you, or at least I agree with some of your reservations, but like the question for me is not like what ought to be happening and what should be done, but what fight is it worth it to me to take up right now? Like, if I'm going to talk about certain things, what do I care about enough to say, like, I am going to bother to talk about this, versus like, well, if I slightly disagree with the prevailing opinion on X, do I care enough about that to make that a big fight for me to, like, what is it worth it to me to talk about? Or,
what's it actually going to affect? And one of the other really great points that Greenwell makes in that article is that this question of relevance makes poetry or art voluble, and it becomes something that we can talk about, and we can we can get into it with each other. And some people love to do that. Some people love to yell about the Yankees, and that's just really fun. But I think what you're saying, I completely agree with. I would much rather keep quiet, let other people do all that talking, and think about, okay, well, what kind of change can I affect here? Me personally.
I had to look, because it occurred to me that some other listeners may have my problem, which is having heard the word voluble a million times and still not really knowing what it means. So I just looked it up for everybody's benefit, or for my own benefit. But it's defined here as being of a person. It's either like a person is talking fluently, readily, or incessantly, and then of speech, it means characterized by fluency and readiness of an utterance. And so in this case, Greenwell suggests that it brings, that relevance is a way to bring something into a conversation or make it possible to speak about it. Interestingly, though, the etymology comes from volvere, to roll. So it's rotating about an axis or turning.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, which maybe suggests something about this, that this is not static. This is not fixed.
My very idiosyncratic take on the whole Carson Wee et al. Controversies is something like, but I don't think the poem's very good.
No.
Like,
I don't think it's terrible. I don't think it's
his poem.
But it's like it's not worth a fight.
Yeah, it just wasn't very interesting.
Yeah.
And
I thought similarly about the Matthew Dickman poem that caused the big
that's
down.
exactly what I was about to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to summarize that real quick? Because I don't think I can't remember if we talked about that on here or not. But would you just quickly summarize what happened with that?
Me?
Or I can if you don't. Yeah, if you don't.
Like, I can try. You both of you can pop in if I get anything wrong. Matthew Dickman published a poem.
Oh shit! I said Matthew Dickman. Was it Matthew or was it
Michael?
Oh
no, Mike. It was Dickman something. It was something Dickman.
Because they're twin brothers and they both write poems and they're both very successful poets.
It could be like.
And I always confuse them. Okay.
I think it's Michael.
I'm googling Dickman racist poem.
That should go well.
Yeah.
Please don't.
Michael. It was Michael.
Okay.
Yeah.
Michael Dickman published a poem called Skulls Ferry Road in the whatever issue of Poetry Magazine in 2020. I want to say 2020. So, yeah. And there was a big a lot of social media controversy, because in one part of this very long, rambling, and at times very prosaic poem,
it's like 20 pages, like extremely long.
Oh god, yeah. He talks about his grandmother, I think, getting on buses and not liking black people on buses, and he uses a racial slur. A lot of people on social media come out against this. It was like I was very interested by their comment. I was very interested by the comment someone made of something like racism in your family is not like your artistic. It's not something you should use as artistic value. It's like your dirty laundry or something. Like it was interesting, and like I thought, I don't know if I agree with that, but I can certainly see where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But like this entire thing toppled Don Scher.
Yeah.
Like he seemed nice. He published a lot of bad poems, but like he seemed a nice guy. He edited the poems of Basil Bunting, which, if you ask me, is his best contribution to literature.
No, I mean, yeah. I didn't think he deserved to. I thought he deserved not to be editor of poetry, but not for this. But it all. I mean, so I don't want to name names because I don't know if this person would want me saying this in public. But a friend of mine pointed out that what he found frustrating about the controversy, because I think like what got a little mixed up is like it wasn't just that he published this poem and the poem included an offensive word and it was written by a white guy. It was that it took up the whole fucking issue. It was so long. It was so and like several pages of the poem were just like one or two lines. So it was just like it was even like just ostentatiously occupying space, and it was published like right in the whitest white heat. Sorry, it was a poor choice of words. In the hottest moment of the George Floyd protest, like it was a very strangely chosen moment, and it was such a long poem, and it just seemed if nothing else sort of tone deaf as a choice, and it was like a very unremarkable poem. It didn't like I thought some of it was kind of nice, some of it was dull, and it just didn't do much to me one way or the other. But what a friend pointed out, I think, was that what seemed frustrating is that it wasn't just a poem in which a white guy used a racial slur, and it wasn't just a poem in which a white guy like took his racist relative as fodder for art. It was actually a poem in which there was an attempt. I mean, I think albeit a pretty clumsy one, but like there was a real attempt to address a history of racism in one's own family. That in a way, like, this is a kind of poem that 15 years ago, I saw over and over and over again essays written by non-white poets saying, why aren't white poets not writing about this stuff? Like I think it was it was a good faith attempt on Dickman's part to say, hey, my family isn't immune from this. Like, this does play a part in my own life, and like I did hear these things growing up, and they made them strike my ear in a certain way, and like, what does that mean, and how does that affect, like, whether or not the poem had any value to it. And I again, like, I could take or leave the whole poem. Like, it was not just that it was an inadvertently racist poem. I mean, it was a poem in which he was trying to do the thing that one would think one would want to do if you're writing a poem about racism.
Yeah, maybe that's what Don Scher saw in it as well. I mean, it seems insane to dedicate an entire issue to it, but
I don't think it was the entire issue, but boy, it was like a lot of the issue. It was so long.
Yeah. I remember seeing Claudia Rankin read, and she was reading her own stuff, but also she read from a book called Shut Up, Shut Down by Mark Nowak. And that was just about, this was in mid-2016, so just before the election happened, and she was just talking about that exact same thing, that real need or desire that she had to see white writers interrogating whiteness. And she was like, Mark Nowak is actually doing this. More of you should be doing this.
Yeah. I remember hearing her say that when I took her class in college. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, totally. It was, again, just exceptionally poor timing, among many other bad judgments, like that maybe reveal other like related reasons that he was not a good editor. Unfortunately.
Oh, and it was just after they released that really like pathetically just sort of
the whole thing where they
the whole lukewarm like
statement
we're in
that then they got the
that just sounded so inauthentic. Yeah, and then got the board knocked out.
Okay, yeah. Oh man, what a mess. Yeah.
But
I forgot because of you, Cameron, because like you reminded me how good a resource their website is. I forgot how like disappointing they are as an organization. All right, that was the show. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com. You can find Cameron on Eratosphere. He is W.T. Clark. And you can find Alice, of course, on Poetry Says. She had a really, really like sweet, charming, short episode this past week about learning to read. What a darling. What a sweetheart. What a dancing Matilda. Is that something they say down there? Or is that... did I just do a Me Too? I don't know. In any event, we're all grateful. Thanks so much for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.